There is a recurring question that surfaces in relationships marked by confusion and inconsistency. Why does the behavior feel so patterned, almost scripted, even when the circumstances change? Different situations, different conversations, sometimes even different people, yet the reactions seem familiar. Predictable, in a way that becomes difficult to ignore. At first, this predictability can be misinterpreted as intentional repetition, as if each action were carefully planned. But the reality is more structural than strategic. The behavior appears consistent not because every move is calculated in advance, but because it is driven by a relatively stable internal framework, one that shapes how other people are perceived. To understand why the behavior repeats, it is necessary to understand how perception is organized. For most people, relationships involve a process of continuous updating. As new information becomes available, through interaction, communication, and shared experience, perception adjusts. A person is seen not only for who they initially appeared to be, but for who they demonstrate themselves to be over time. In narcissistic dynamics, this process is often more constrained. Perception is less fluid. It is filtered through pre-existing needs, expectations, and internal categories. Rather than being shaped primarily by who the other person is, it is shaped by what function the other person serves. This is the first critical shift. You are not only seen as an individual with independent thoughts, emotions, and complexity. You are also seen in terms of how you fit into a structure, how you contribute to validation, stability, or self-image. This does not mean there is no recognition of individuality at all. It means that individuality is often secondary to function. At the beginning of a relationship, this function is typically aligned with positive reinforcement. The other person is perceived as engaging, affirming, responsive. The interaction feels energizing. There is a sense of connection that appears strong, sometimes unusually so. This phase is often characterized by intensity. Attention is focused. Engagement is consistent. The interaction feels mutual, even if the underlying motivations differ. From the outside, this can look like compatibility. From the inside, it often feels like alignment. But what is actually happening is a form of projection. The other person is being interpreted through an idealized lens. Their qualities are emphasized in ways that fit the desired narrative. Their presence supports a particular self-perception. The connection, while real in experience, is partially constructed in interpretation. As the relationship continues, reality begins to introduce variability. Differences emerge. Boundaries are expressed. Expectations are not always met. The interaction becomes less predictable, less aligned with the initial projection. At this point, perception begins to shift. Not necessarily in a gradual, integrative way, but in a more categorical one. The individual is no longer seen primarily through the initial idealized lens. Instead, they may be reinterpreted as inconsistent, difficult, or misaligned. This shift is often abrupt from the partner's perspective. One moment, there is engagement. The next, there is distance. The underlying reason is not always communicated clearly, because it is not always fully processed in a reflective way. It is a reclassification, rather than a negotiated change. And once this reclassification occurs, behavior follows. This is where predictability becomes visible. Because the behavior is not being generated fresh in each moment. It is being guided by the current category in which the other person is placed. If the person is seen as supportive, the behavior aligns with that perception. If the person is seen as challenging, the behavior shifts accordingly. The response is consistent, not because the situation is identical, but because the interpretation is. This pattern can repeat across different relationships. Different individuals may be placed into similar categories, and the responses to those categories remain stable. This creates the impression that the same dynamics are occurring repeatedly, even with different people. In many cases, that impression is accurate. The external variables change, but the internal framework remains largely the same. This framework is often organized around maintaining a certain sense of self. Perception is filtered in a way that supports that stability. Interactions are interpreted through that filter. And behavior is generated in response to those interpretations. When something aligns with the framework, engagement is smooth. When something challenges it, tension emerges. This is why behavior can appear disproportionate or inconsistent from the outside. The reaction is not only to the immediate situation, but to what the situation represents within the internal structure. A small disagreement, for example, may not be processed simply as a difference of opinion. It may be interpreted as a disruption to alignment. The response, therefore, is not calibrated solely to the content of the disagreement, but to its perceived significance within the framework. This creates a mismatch between external event and internal reaction. And over time, that mismatch becomes a source of confusion. For the person on the receiving end, the experience can feel unpredictable. The same behavior may lead to different reactions. Attempts to understand or stabilize the interaction may not produce consistent results. The logic behind the responses is not immediately visible, because it is not based solely on observable events. It is based on interpretation. Understanding this shifts the focus. Instead of trying to decode each individual reaction in isolation, attention moves to the underlying pattern. How are situations being interpreted? What categories are being applied? How stable are those categories over time? These questions provide more insight than any single interaction. They reveal the structure behind the behavior. At the same time, it is important to recognize that this pattern is not necessarily intentional in the way it is often assumed to be. It is not always a deliberate choice to misinterpret or to react in a certain way. It is often a function of how perception is organized and how information is processed. This does not remove responsibility for behavior, but it clarifies its origin. And clarity allows for more accurate expectations. If behavior is driven by a stable internal framework, then expecting it to change significantly without a corresponding shift in that framework may not be realistic. Individual actions may vary, but the overall pattern tends to persist. This has practical implications. It suggests that consistency in response may be more effective than attempts to adapt to each individual fluctuation. It highlights the importance of boundaries that are based on observed patterns, rather than on isolated events. It emphasizes the value of evaluating behavior over time, rather than relying on momentary improvements. Most importantly, it reduces confusion. Because once the pattern is recognized, the behavior is no longer interpreted as random. It becomes predictable. Not in the sense that every action can be anticipated in detail, but in the sense that the range of possible responses becomes clearer. The variability narrows. The structure becomes visible. And when the structure is visible, decision-making becomes more grounded. There is less reliance on hope that a single interaction will change the pattern. There is more emphasis on what has been consistently demonstrated. There is less need to interpret each response as a new data point, and more ability to see it as part of an existing sequence. This does not necessarily make the situation easier, but it makes it more understandable. And understanding, in this context, is not about assigning labels or reaching definitive conclusions about another person. It is about aligning perception with observable reality. Because when perception is aligned, confusion decreases. And when confusion decreases, the same patterns that once felt unpredictable begin to reveal themselves for what they are. Consistent, structured, and, in many cases, unlikely to change without a deeper shift than surface-level interaction can produce.